before names were given to things, before borders were imagined, before stories learned how to walk from mouth to mouth, there were the mountains. They stood quietly, rising from the earth as they always had, their slopes softened by time, their peaks sharpened by wind. Snow gathered in the hollows where sunlight rarely reached, melting slowly, patiently, feeding thin streams that slipped downward through stone and moss. These streams did not hurry. They followed gravity without urgency, tracing paths that would remain long after the first humans arrived. The air here was thin, cool, and clean. It carried the faint scent of stone warmed by the sun during the day and the sharper bite of frost when shadows stretched long in the evening. Wind moved freely, unbroken by walls or roofs, brushing across rock faces and whispering through narrow passes. At night, the sound of it deepened, low and steady, like a breath taken by the earth itself. Long before memory learned to keep records, small figures appeared against this vastness. They moved slowly, not because they were weak, but because the mountains demanded slowness. Each step mattered. Each foothold was tested with care. A loose stone could mean a fall. A misjudged slope could end a journey before it truly began. These early humans, hunters, gatherers, wanderers without a word for themselves, learned quickly that the mountains rewarded attention. They climbed not with certainty, but with curiosity. Below them, far beyond the ridges and folds of stone, wide valleys spread out like open hands. Rivers moved more confidently there. Animals gathered in greater numbers. Plants grew taller, richer, easier to harvest. And yet, some people felt a quiet pull upward, toward the places where life was harder but silence was deeper. No one recorded why. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was accident. Perhaps it was simply that a hunting path led higher one day and did not turn back. Whatever the reason, small groups began to linger in the heights. They slept near rock overhangs. They learned which slopes caught the morning sun and which remained frozen until midday. They listened. Listening was survival. The mountains spoke in subtle ways. Snowpack groaned before a shift. Birds fell silent before storms. Winds changed direction without warning. The people who stayed learned to notice these things, not all at once but gradually, through repetition and quiet failure. A fire built too close to a cave wall filled the space with smoke. So the next fire was built closer to the mouth. A shelter placed carelessly collapsed under the weight of early snow. The next was reinforced with stone. Each mistake left a trace, and each correction became part of a growing, unspoken knowledge. Time moved differently here. Days were shaped by light rather than clocks. Morning arrived softly, a pale glow creeping over ridges, touching peaks before it reached the valleys below. Evenings stretched long, shadows climbing upward as the sun retreated. Night settled fully, deeply, bringing cold that pressed into bone and breath. The stars appeared sharper in the thin air, more numerous, more present. People lay on their backs, wrapped in hides, staring upward. There were no names yet for constellations, but patterns were noticed all the same. Certain stars returned at certain times. Seasons announced themselves quietly through the sky. These observations were not written down. They were felt, remembered, repeated. Memory lived in bodies. Hands remembered how much pressure stone could take before splitting. Feet remembered which paths were safest after rain. Lungs remembered the rhythm of breathing needed to climb without exhaustion. Children learn not through instruction, but through watching, copying, following. The mountains allowed no shortcuts. Food was gathered slowly. Roots were dug carefully from thin soil clinging to slopes. Small animals were tracked over long distances, their paths winding and uneven. Every meal was earned with effort and eaten with attention. There was no abundance here, only enough. And enough was respected. Silence filled the spaces between actions. There was little need for constant sound. Voices carried too far in the thin air, echoing off stone, alerting animals, and sometimes other humans of presence. So movements became quieter. Gestures replaced words. Communication softened. In this way, a different kind of culture began to form. Not one built on speed or growth, but on endurance. The mountains did not change quickly, and neither did the people who chose to stay among them. Seasons repeated themselves with gentle variation. Snow came earlier some years, later in others. Summers were brief but intense, sunlight lingering long into evening, warming rock and skin alike. These rhythms taught patience. Waiting became a skill. Waiting for weather to clear, waiting for animals to pass through familiar corridors, waiting for snow to soften enough to travel safely. In the valleys, waiting might feel like wasted time. In the mountains, it was simply part of life. Over many lifetimes, the presence of humans became woven into the landscape. Paths formed where feet passed again and again. Stones were rearranged, subtly at first, stacked for shelter, placed to mark safe crossings. Smoke rose occasionally from fires, thin and pale against dark rock, then vanished into the wind. There were no cities, no walls, no monuments. Only continuity. The mountains watched as generations came and went. Bones returned to soil. Tools were lost, found, reused. Children grew into adults who grew into elders whose knowledge was passed not through authority, but through proximity. You learned by staying close, by paying attention, by moving slowly enough to notice what mattered. Far below, the valleys continued their own quiet transformations. Rivers widened. Herds followed predictable routes. Human groups gathered in larger numbers. But up here, change remained subtle, almost invisible. And yet, something important was taking shape. A way of seeing the world that valued balance over control, observation over force, adaptation over domination. These ideas were not spoken aloud, but they lived in daily choices, in when to travel, where to settle, how much to take. The mountains shaped the people, and the people, in return, learned not to shape the mountains too much. As night fell once more, stars brightened overhead. Wind moved steadily through passes carved long before any human footstep. Fires burned low, their warmth contained, their light modest. Breathing slowed. Muscles rested. The world felt vast but not hostile. And in this quiet balance, between stone and flesh, cold and warmth, movement and stillness, the earliest mountain tribes began their long, unseen role in shaping the civilizations that would one day rise far below them. But for now, there was only the mountain, and the slow, patient beginning of memory. The first true steps into the high places were hesitant. Not because the people were unsure of themselves, but because the land asked for care. The slope rose gently at first, almost deceptively so, covered in short grasses that bent easily beneath the wind. Beyond that, the ground hardened. Soil thinned. Stone began to show through, pale and weathered, its surface etched by centuries of ice and rain. A small group moved upward together. They did not walk in a line, but in a loose pattern shaped by instinct and experience. One adult moved slightly ahead, pausing often, testing the ground with the weight of a foot before committing fully. Others followed at a measured distance, watching closely, memorizing where feet had landed safely. Children stayed near the center, their smaller steps lighter, their eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. The air changed as they climbed. It grew cooler, drier, carrying fewer scents from plants and animals below. Breathing became more noticeable. Each inhale felt thinner, each exhale more deliberate. The body adjusted slowly, learning a new rhythm without conscious thought. No one spoke about it. There was no need. Above them, clouds drifted low and slow, brushing the tops of distant ridges. Sunlight slipped in and out of shadow, warming skin briefly before retreating again. The sensation of heat and cold alternated gently, reminding them that the mountain controlled the pace here. They paused often, not just to rest but to listen. Listening meant more than hearing sound. It meant noticing absence, the lack of insects, the sudden quiet of birds, the faint, distant crack of ice shifting somewhere unseen. These signals carried meaning, though no words yet existed to name them. When they stopped, they crouched rather than sat, keeping bodies ready to move again. Hands rested against stone, feeling its texture cool, rough, steady. Rock did not shift like soil. It did not hide holes or give way without warning. It could be trusted if respected. The path they followed was not chosen randomly. It was shaped by animals. Thin trails cut across slopes at gentle angles, worn smooth by generations of hooves. These paths avoided steep climbs and sudden drops, favoring gradual ascent. The people recognized wisdom in this. They followed without question, stepping where deer and goats had stepped long before. Occasionally, they stopped to drink. Water appeared unexpectedly here, seeping from cracks in stone, pooling briefly before vanishing again. These were not rivers yet, just beginnings. The water was cold, clear, sharp against the tongue. It tasted of stone and snow, of distance and time. They drank slowly, knowing not to empty every source, knowing that others, human or not, might need it too. As the day stretched on, the landscape grew quieter. The familiar sounds of the lowlands faded completely. No distant calls, no layered noise of many lives moving at once. Here, sound traveled far but occurred rarely. A footstep echoed softly. A stone dislodged by accident clattered downward, its sound lingering long after the motion stopped. That lingering mattered. It taught caution. The group adjusted their movements, stepping more carefully, choosing paths that minimized disturbance. They learned quickly that the mountain noticed everything. It responded not with anger but with consequence. Clouds thickened as afternoon passed. The light softened, turning pale and diffuse. Shadows blurred rather than sharpened. Wind picked up, brushing across exposed skin, threading through hair and hides. It carried the smell of cold places higher still, places where snow remained even in warm seasons. One adult stopped and raised a hand. Everyone froze. The gesture was subtle but instantly understood. Stillness spread through the group. Breathing slowed. Eyes followed the direction of the raised hand, toward a narrow pass between two stone outcrops. Nothing moved. At first. Then a shape appeared. A mountain goat standing perfectly balanced on a ledge that seemed impossibly narrow. Its coat blended with the stone, its eyes alert but calm. It watched them as they watched it. For a long moment, neither side moved. The goat was not afraid. That alone was a lesson. It showed that life was possible here, that paths existed where none seemed obvious. That balance mattered more than strength. When the goat finally turned and disappeared into higher ground, the group remained still for several breaths longer, letting the moment settle into memory. They moved on. As the sun dipped lower, they searched for a place to rest. Not anywhere would do. The mountain demanded selectivity. They looked for rock formations that broke the wind, for ground that sloped gently rather than sharply, for signs of water nearby. They found a shallow hollow beneath an overhang of stone. The space was small but protected. Wind curved around it instead of rushing through. The rock above held warmth from the day, radiating it slowly as evening approached. They cleared loose stones, careful not to disturb more than necessary. A fire was built. Not large, just enough. Flames flickered softly, their light reflecting off stone, creating slow-moving shadows that stretched and shifted. The smell of smoke rose straight up at first, then thinned and disappeared. Food was prepared quietly, chewed slowly, shared evenly. As darkness settled fully, cold deepened. The fire became the center of attention, not visually but emotionally. It offered warmth, comfort, reassurance. Bodies leaned toward it. Hands extended briefly, then withdrew. Sparks rose and vanished. Above them the sky opened. Stars appeared one by one, then in clusters, then in overwhelming number. Here, without smoke or dust from many fires, the night sky revealed itself fully. The stars felt closer somehow, sharper, more present. Some seemed to move, though they did not. Others returned night after night, quietly reliable. The people lay back against stone and watched. No stories were told yet, no meanings assigned, but patterns were noticed, the slow turning of the sky, the way certain stars touched the horizon before others. These observations settled into the mind gently, without urgency. Sleep came slowly. Wrapped in hides, bodies adjusted to the uneven ground. The stone beneath was firm, unyielding, but familiar now. Wind moved steadily above, its sound low and continuous. Occasionally, a distant crack echoed from somewhere higher, a reminder of ice shifting in the night. No one panicked. The mountain had already taught them that sound did not always mean danger. Morning arrived gradually. Light returned first to the highest peaks, igniting them in pale gold before sliding downward. Frost glittered briefly on stone, then vanished as warmth returned. Breath steamed in the air. Limbs stretched stiffly. The fire was coaxed back to life, embers glowing beneath ash. They ate again, drank again, prepared to move. No one spoke about turning back. The decision had already been made, not consciously but collectively. Each step upward had felt difficult, yes, but also right. The mountain had not rejected them. It had tested them quietly and found them attentive enough to continue. As they packed what little they carried, the hollow they had slept in remained almost unchanged. A few stones moved, ash scattered, footprints already fading. The mountain reclaimed space quickly. They stepped onward, higher into the thinning air, into a life that would shape them slowly, deeply, and permanently. And with those first careful footsteps, humanity's long relationship with the high places truly began. The mountains did not teach through instruction. They taught through repetition. Morning after morning, the same wind returned, brushing across exposed skin, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and bare rock. Some days it was gentle, almost curious, slipping quietly through narrow gaps. Other days it pressed hard against the body, leaning into bone and muscle, forcing movement to slow even further. The people learned not to fight it. They leaned when the wind leaned, paused when it grew impatient, and waited when it refused passage altogether. Waiting became a form of listening. Stone revealed itself slowly. At first it was simply ground, solid, reliable, cold. But over time differences emerged. Some rock fractured easily under pressure, breaking cleanly into sharp-edged pieces perfect for cutting. Other stone resisted, dulling tools and numbing hands. These distinctions were not named but remembered. Certain outcrops became familiar, revisited again and again, their usefulness understood through touch rather than explanation. Hands learned the weight of stone. They learned how it responded to force, how a strike too hard shattered what could have been useful, and how a strike too soft wasted effort. Tool-making here was not hurried. A person might sit for hours, legs folded beneath them, turning a single piece of stone over and over, feeling its balance, tracing its natural lines with their fingers before striking even once. Around them, life continued quietly. Birds nested in places unreachable by human hands. Small animals moved along ledges with ease that seemed impossible. The people watched closely, learning paths from creatures who had mastered this terrain long before humans arrived. Where animals crossed, stone was usually stable. Where they avoided, danger often waited unseen. Shelter became the next lesson. Caves were tempting, ready-made protection from wind and snow, but not all caves were safe. Some trapped smoke, filling lungs with burning air. Others collected cold, dampness settling into bones during long nights. Over time, preferences formed. Shallow overhangs that allowed smoke to escape. Rock faces that caught sunlight during the day and released it slowly at night. Building here meant adjusting, not imposing. Stones were stacked carefully, fitted together without force. Walls curved slightly, following the land rather than resisting it. Roofs were angled so snow slid away instead of accumulating. Every structure felt temporary, even when it lasted generations. The people did not expect permanence. They expected endurance. Fire remained central. Lighting it at altitude required patience. Wind interfered, fuel was scarce. Dry wood had to be gathered from lower slopes and carried upward, each piece precious. Flames were kept small and controlled, fed slowly, never allowed to roar. Fire was warmth, light, and survival, but also danger if mishandled. The crackle of burning wood became a familiar sound, one that marked safety in the deepening cold of evening. Its glow softened stone walls, turning harsh edges gentle. People gathered around it not for conversation, but for presence. Silence shared felt different than silence alone. As days passed, weather patterns began to repeat. Clouds often arrived from the same direction. Storms built slowly, announced by subtle shifts. The way wind dropped suddenly, the way birds vanished from the sky. Snow did not fall without warning. The mountain always spoke first if one knew how to listen. The people learned. They learned when to descend temporarily, when to stay sheltered, when to press onward despite discomfort. Survival here did not belong to the strongest, but to the most attentive. Children absorbed this knowledge without effort. They watched adults pause before stepping onto new ground. They noticed how eyes scanned slopes instinctively, how hands brushed stone lightly before trusting it. No one explained these habits. Explanation was unnecessary. Imitation was enough. At night, as bodies rested against stone walls, thoughts wandered. Not forward into the future, but outward into the land itself. The mountain was no longer separate from life. It shaped sleep, hunger, movement, and rest. It dictated pace. It demanded humility. And in return, it offered clarity. Up here, life felt stripped of excess. There were fewer choices, fewer distractions. Each action mattered. Each mistake echoed longer. This simplicity did not feel empty. It felt focused. Time passed without measurement. Days blended together, distinguished only by changes in weather or the slow progress of the seasons. The sun climbed slightly higher each day, warming slopes that had remained frozen before. Snow retreated inch by inch, revealing dark soil beneath. With thaw came new scents. Damp earth, meltwater, stone newly exposed to air. These smells carried meaning, signaling opportunities to gather, to explore further, to adjust routines. Food sources shifted subtly. Certain plants emerged briefly, then vanished again, their timing precise and unforgiving. The people adapted. They learned to move with these brief windows, harvesting without haste, storing without excess. Nothing here encouraged hoarding. Carrying too much made movement dangerous. Balance was everything. Wind remained a constant teacher. It revealed weaknesses in shelters, finding gaps invisible to the eye. It tested clothing, slipping through poor stitching. It punished careless planning but rewarded thoughtful design. Over time, garments improved, seams tightened, layers adjusted. Every improvement came from experience, not invention. High above the valleys where rivers flowed wide and forgiving, knowledge here grew slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. No one recorded it, no one announced it, but it accumulated all the same, settling into muscle memory, into instinct. And with each passing season, the people became less like visitors and more like residents. The mountain no longer felt hostile, it felt familiar. Danger still existed, always would, but fear softened into respect. The land did not seek to harm them, it simply demanded attention. As evening returned once more, firelight flickered against stone. Wind sang its low, steady song through the passes. Stars emerged overhead, reliable and patient. The people rested. And in that rest, the language of stone and wind continued to settle deeper, shaping not just how they lived, but how they understood the world. The passing of time in the mountains was not announced by calendars or counted by marks on stone. It was felt. It lived in the gradual shortening of shadows, in the way snow lingered longer in shaded crevices while slopes facing the sun softened earlier each year. It lived in the steady strengthening of the body, lungs adjusting to thin air, muscles learning the quiet strength needed for climbing rather than speed. Knowledge here did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Each day added a thin layer, like frost forming overnight, almost invisible on its own, but undeniable when gathered across seasons. Morning began before the sun touched the valley below. Light crept first across the highest ridges, pale and cautious, illuminating stone faces that had stood unchanged for countless lifetimes. The people rose slowly, joints stiff from cold, breath visible as faint clouds. Fires were coaxed back to life with practiced patience. Ash was moved carefully, embers protected from the wind. Hands warmed. Thoughts settled. There was no rush to begin. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes here were remembered by the body long after they were made. The people moved outward from their shelters in familiar patterns. Some followed known paths toward water. Others climbed short distances to observe the sky and slopes beyond. These daily movements were almost ritualistic, though no one would have named them as such. Repetition created certainty. Water sources were checked first. Meltwater streams shifted subtly each year, their paths reshaped by freeze and thaw. A trickle that ran reliably one season might vanish the next, diverted beneath stone. The people learned to read the signs: darkened rock, moss growth, the sound of water moving unseen beneath the surface. When water was found, it was approached carefully. Hands were cupped gently. No one stepped directly into the source. Disturbance clouded clarity, and clarity mattered. Drinking was slow, deliberate. Cold water shocked the tongue, then settled into the body, spreading outward, steady and grounding. From water, attention moved to stone. Not all stone was equal, and this understanding deepened with time. Some rock fractured cleanly, producing sharp edges ideal for cutting hides or shaping wood. Other stones splintered unpredictably, dangerous to work with. These qualities were learned not through theory, but through injury, through broken tools, through long hours spent correcting mistakes. Certain places became known for their stone. These places were revisited season after season, generation after generation. Paths to them were maintained instinctively, stones cleared just enough to allow safe passage. Nothing was marked permanently. Memory was enough. Tool-making became quieter, more refined. Early efforts had been loud, clumsy, stone striking stone with uncertain force. Now strikes were measured, angles chosen carefully. A single tool might take hours to shape, pauses taken often to reassess balance and edge. While one person worked, others watched. Not as students watching a teacher, but as participants absorbing motion, rhythm, restraint. Learning happened in silence. Correction happened through example rather than instruction. Shelter building followed the same pattern. Early structures had been crude, built quickly against sudden weather. Over time, designs improved. Walls curved slightly inward, better resisting wind. Stones were selected for shape as much as size, fitted together like pieces already meant to touch. Earth was used sparingly. Soil was thin here, precious. It was packed into gaps only where necessary, reinforced with plant fibers gathered from lower slopes. Nothing was wasted. Everything was reused when possible. Even failure became useful. A collapsed wall revealed weak points. A shelter that stayed cold despite fire taught lessons about airflow. These lessons were remembered not as abstract ideas but as sensations: cold fingers, smoke-stung eyes, sleepless nights. The mountains taught through discomfort. Season by season, patterns emerged. The people noticed when storms tended to arrive, how long snow stayed on certain slopes, how sunlight shifted across familiar landmarks. These observations were shared subtly. A pause here, a changed route there. No grand announcements were needed. children learned this rhythm naturally. They followed adults without question, their small feet stepping into prints already tested. They learned where to slow, where to climb, where to wait. Their questions, if they existed, were answered by experience rather than explanation. As years passed, elders emerged, not by title but by presence. These were individuals whose movements were slower but surer, whose eyes noticed small changes others missed. When they paused, others paused too. When they chose a path, it was followed without debate. Authority here came from endurance. Memory stretched beyond a single lifetime. Stories existed but not as entertainment. They were woven into daily life, embedded in warnings and habits. A place avoided because stone fell there once. A route favored because it holds in spring. These fragments of history traveled quietly through time. Metal had not yet fully entered their world, but hints of it appeared. Certain stones stained hands green or red. Others gleamed faintly when broken open. These curiosities were collected, examined, carried from place to place. Fire altered them in small ways, colors deepening, surfaces changing. The people noticed. Nothing was rushed. Curiosity remained patient. Food gathering became increasingly efficient. Plants that survived here were hardy, their cycles brief. The people learned exactly when to harvest, exactly how much to take. Seeds were saved carefully, wrapped, protected from moisture and cold. Experiments happened slowly, seeds planted in slightly different places, watched over seasons. Some failed. Some succeeded. Success was remembered. The body itself became an archive. Scars told stories of sharp stone and cold nights. Calloused hands recorded years of work. Lungs carried the memory of thin air, adapting fully to the altitude. Even rest changed. Sleep came lighter here, shaped by cold and sound. People learned to wake briefly at night, checking fire, listening to wind, then returning to rest without anxiety. Vigilance became calm rather than tense. Above all, the people learned balance. Taking without stripping, building without scarring, staying without claiming ownership. The mountain was not something to conquer, it was something to live alongside. Far below in the valleys, life continued on a different path, one of expansion, accumulation, density. But up here, knowledge grew inward rather than outward. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. As dusk fell once more, shadows deepened across familiar slopes. Fires were lit, tools set aside, food shared evenly. Wind carried the scent of stone and smoke into the darkening air. Stars emerged again, patient and unchanged. The people rested, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same, and that in that sameness, wisdom continued to grow. The idea of planting did not arrive suddenly in the mountains. It emerged slowly, like grass pushing its way through thin soil, almost unnoticed at first. At the edges of familiar paths, where water paused just long enough to soften the ground, certain plants returned year after year. Their leaves were small but resilient. Their roots held fast to stone. When harvested carefully, they returned again the following season, as if remembering where they had been touched. The people noticed. Not with excitement, but with calm attention. They began to linger near these places, observing how sunlight moved across the slope, how long moisture remained after snowmelt, how frost retreated unevenly depending on shadow and stone. They did not speak of ownership. These were not fields in the way valleys would later understand them. They were simply places that responded well to care. Care here was subtle. Hands loosened soil gently, careful not to disturb what little held it together. Stones were rearranged, not removed entirely but repositioned to slow water to keep earth from slipping away. The work was quiet, almost meditative. No wide gestures, no heavy tools, just fingers, patience, and time. Terraces began as accidents. A small ledge where soil collected naturally, a fallen rock that created a shallow barrier. These were noticed and remembered. Over seasons, they were reinforced. Stones were stacked carefully, each one tested for balance before being released. Walls curved slightly, following the slope rather than cutting against it. These early terraces did not look impressive. They were narrow, uneven, often no wider than a person's outstretched arms, but they held soil, and soil here was precious. Seeds were placed with intention. Not scattered but pressed gently into earth, covered just enough to protect them from wind and birds. The act of planting was slow, almost reverent. Each seed represented effort gathered, carried, saved through cold nights. Waste was unthinkable. Then came waiting. Waiting without certainty. Some seeds sprouted, others did not. Some were taken by frost, others by animals. The people did not respond with frustration. Loss was expected. What mattered was pattern, what survived, where and why. Over time, understanding deepened. South-facing slopes warmed earlier. North-facing ones held moisture longer. Certain plants preferred the shelter of stone walls. Others thrived in open light despite harsher wind. These preferences were not written down. They were lived. Tending fields became part of daily movement. Not a separate task, but woven into routines, checking water, gathering stone, observing weather. A terrace might be visited briefly, soil pressed back into place after rain, a sprout protected with a small ring of stones. The smell of earth became familiar again. Damp soil carried a scent different from valley fields, sharper, thinner, mixed with stone. When warmed by sun, it released a quiet sweetness that lingered briefly before wind carried it away. Harvests were modest, enough to supplement gathered food, not replace it. Roots were dug carefully, leaving part of the plant intact whenever possible. Leaves were cut, not torn. Seeds were collected last when fully mature. Storage required ingenuity. Cold preserved some foods naturally, but moisture threatened spoilage. The people learned to use stone-lined pits, shaded crevices, and airflow to their advantage. Food was wrapped, layered, protected. Nothing here allowed carelessness. Agriculture did not make life easier. It made it steadier. Hunger became less unpredictable. Journeys to lower slopes became less frequent. The people could remain in the high places longer, watching seasons turn without retreat. With farming came rhythm. Certain days became known for planting, others for harvest. These moments were marked not by dates but by sensations, the angle of sunlight, the feel of air, the return of certain birds. Ritual began to form quietly. Not ceremonies with words or symbols, but repeated actions done the same way each year. A pause before planting, a moment of stillness before harvest. Gratitude was not spoken but practiced through restraint. Children learned these rhythms early. They were given small tasks, placing stones, pressing soil, carrying seeds. Through repetition, they absorbed not just technique but attitude. Farming here was not domination of land. It was conversation. Weather remained the final authority. A single storm could undo weeks of careful work. Heavy rain could collapse a terrace wall. Late frost could blacken leaves overnight. When this happened, there was no anger, only assessment. What failed taught as much as what succeeded. Slowly, varieties of plants were favored. Hardier grains, roots that tolerated cold, leaves that matured quickly. These selections were not intentional breeding in the later sense, but preference shaped by survival. Seeds from successful plants were saved more carefully, planted more often. Over generations, change accumulated. Fields blended into slopes so naturally that it became difficult to tell where mountain ended and human effort began. Stone walls weathered, softened by moss and lichen. From a distance, terraces looked like natural steps formed by erosion. They were meant to look that way. The people did not seek visibility. Their work was for sustenance, not display. Down in the valleys, agriculture would one day transform landscapes dramatically. Wide fields, irrigation systems, surplus stored in vast quantities. But here in the mountains, farming remained intimate. Small scale, attentive, balanced. As evening approached, tools were set aside. Hands were rubbed together, dirt worked into skin. Fires were lit. Meals were simple but satisfying, food grown by familiar slopes, prepared slowly, eaten without haste. The body recognized the difference. Food grown here carried the taste of effort, of patience. It filled without heaviness, warmed without dulling the senses. Night settled once more. Wind moved gently across terrace slopes, brushing over stone walls, whispering through plants rooted carefully in thin soil. Stars emerged overhead, steady and unchanged. The people rested, knowing that even in such quiet work, something powerful was taking shape, knowledge that would one day travel far beyond these hidden fields. But for now, it remained here, held by stone, fed by patience, grown in silence. The mountains did not announce their influence when it finally began to move beyond them. There were no proclamations, no migrations marked by drums or banners. Knowledge simply drifted. It traveled the way meltwater traveled, quietly, patiently downhill. At first, it moved only a short distance. A lone figure descended a familiar pass, carrying little more than a bundle of dried roots, a few carefully wrapped metal-stained stones, and memory carried in muscle and breath. Each step downward felt heavier than ascent ever had. The air thickened, sounds multiplied, smells grew richer, soil, plants, animals, smoke. The valleys felt crowded. People lived closer together here. Fires burned constantly. Voices overlapped. Paths widened into tracks, then into roads worn deep by countless feet. Life here moved faster, pulled forward by abundance and urgency rather than restraint. The mountain people noticed immediately. They moved more slowly than those around them, even when no one asked them to. Their pauses seemed strange. Their silence felt deliberate. They listened more than they spoke. And when they did speak, it was not to explain, only to show. A stone blade shaped differently than any seen before, a seed that survived frost better than others, a way of stacking earth and stone that prevented collapse during heavy rain. These things were offered without ceremony, without insistence. Some were ignored. Others were adopted quietly. A valley farmer noticed that grain planted near a low stone wall grew stronger. A metalworker observed that certain rocks, when heated carefully, softened just enough to reshape rather than shatter. A builder learned that walls angled slightly inward resisted pressure better than straight ones. None of these ideas were credited. They did not need to be. The mountain people did not stay long. They rarely settled in the valleys. The noise weighed on them. The constant movement felt restless. After trading what little they carried, goods, ideas, techniques, they returned upward, their bodies lightening with each step back toward thinner air. But traces remained. Terraces began to appear on valley hillsides, inspired by techniques born of necessity high above. Crops spread into regions once thought too cold or steep. Metalworking improved not through sudden discovery, but through refinement, small changes in heat, timing, patience. Knowledge lost its origin as it spread. This was not theft. It was transformation. The mountains continued their quiet work. As generations passed, valleys grew into towns, towns into cities. Writing appeared, records were kept, names were preserved. Kings and dynasties filled tablets and stone. The mountain tribes did not. They remained largely unwritten. Up high, life continued much as it always had. Fields were tended, stone was shaped, wind was listened to, children learned by watching, elders aged without titles. Occasionally, outsiders came upward, merchants, messengers, refugees. Some came seeking resources, others came fleeing collapse. Empires rose in the valleys, and with them came war, taxation, rigid order. When those systems strained or broke, people looked upward, not because mountains promised ease, but because they promised distance. The mountain people received them quietly. Not all were welcome to stay, but many were taught enough to survive. How to build shelter that resisted wind, how to ration food, how to read weather before it struck. These lessons were not given as ideology but as practice. And so, even as civilizations below fractured and reformed, something steady endured above them. The mountains became archives without walls. They preserved methods no longer fashionable below. They held memories of balance long abandoned elsewhere. They did not resist change aggressively, they simply outlasted it. Centuries passed. Written history expanded but rarely climbed far enough to capture what happened here. Scholars noted metals, crops, architectural features, attributing them to anonymous highland influences. Footnotes without names, origins without faces. The mountain people did not correct them. Their lives were not lived for recognition. Over time, even their distinct identities softened. Some blended into valley populations during long periods of peace. Others retreated further into inaccessible terrain. Terraces crumbled slowly, becoming part of the slope once more. Paths narrowed, then vanished beneath grass and stone. But the knowledge did not vanish. It lived on in practices taken for granted, in fields that curved with hills instead of cutting across them, in stone walls that leaned just enough to endure, in crops that survived unexpected cold, in the understanding that land was something to work with, not against. Even now, long after the last unnamed tribe faded into silence, their influence remains. Modern farmers still terrace steep land without knowing who first did so. Engineers still follow principles of balance and stress, learned first through hands pressing stone into place. Mountain paths still guide travelers along routes chosen by animals and humans thousands of years ago. And the mountains themselves remain. Snow still gathers in the same crevices. Wind still sings through the same passes. Streams still begin as quiet trickles, patient and persistent. If one stands high enough, early enough in the morning, before sound rises from below, the world still feels as it once did. Sparse, clear, balanced. The lesson of the mountains was never meant to be shouted. It was meant to be felt. That survival does not require dominance. That growth does not require speed. That influence does not require credit. As night falls once more, stars return to their places. The sky opens wide, the air cools. Stone releases the warmth it gathered during the day. Somewhere far below, cities glow with restless light. And far above, the mountains hold their silence, unchanged, patient, still shaping the world in ways that do not ask to be seen. The story ends where it began. With stone, with wind, with time moving slowly enough to listen.